There we go. Hi, Peter Charles here, Folks for Life Fly Fishing. And today let's talk about using floating lines to fish for smallmouth bass in our local rivers. Now, if you've fished for smallmouth bass before with floating lines, we normally think of casting poppers and other floating flies to get bass, and it works, that's fine. But I'm going to talk about using floating lines to fish streamers very high in the water column, like literally about that much under the surface. I mean, we're fishing so close to the surface, when the bass hit the fly, they often break the surface of the water. We actually see the hit. So we're that shallow. And that doesn't sound like a very productive method, but it does actually work if you think about what these bass normally feed on. They're feeding on bait fish. And where are those bait fish? Well, sometimes they're near the bottom, but sometimes they're very close to the surface. Those bait fish are feeding on diatoms, zooplankton, organic detritus that are flowing down the river, very small insects, maybe some really tiny freshwater shrimp, fish eggs that might be floating in the river for any type of species that disperses their eggs. Who knows what they end up eating, but they're often very high up in the water column. And you'll see, that's the reason why you'll see seagulls and terns and kingfishers really don't have to penetrate the water very far to pick up a meal, because these little fish are so close to the surface. The other thing I want you to think about is the relationship of size to current. When you have almost dead water or slow water, those little bait fish, forage fish, can be tiny, half an inch to an inch long. When there's a bit of current flow, you'll see bait fish somewhere in that 1 to 2 inch range. When the water gets a little higher in flow rate, then we're getting bigger bait fish, 3 inches, 4 inches. And that's because those bait fish are better swimmers. They can handle the current better, and the current is a better source of food. Just like trout, they're just vacuuming up the food that drifts towards them. And they're sitting high up in the water column in those faster currents, picking off whatever's drifting their way, and the bass come up underneath and grab them. And that's what we're imitating. So when you're fishing this kind of water, you want a fly that does a reasonably good job of imitating a swimming bait fish of about the right size for the speed of the water, and you're going to present that fly just an inch or two underneath the water. You don't have to get it down very far. Even if it's down 6 inches, that's fine. It doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about managing depth all that much. I do try to manage speed, though. I do want this to move fairly slowly. I don't want it to be zippity-doo-dahing all over the river. I do use some mends, which we'll see in this footage, of how I slow the fly down and sink it a little bit, make it a little bit more appealing. So let's take a look at the footage of how I'm using floating lines with streamers to get bass, and those flies are like this far under the surface of the water. So let's check it out. Okay, in our first scenario here, we have some very slow water near me, and that foam line represents some fairly fast current. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast my fly so it lands on the far side of that current. You can see in that foam line. And I'm just going to allow the line to swing out. I'm not going to mend. I don't have to mend, because that fast water will keep my line straight, and I keep letting it swing round, and just as it leaves that foam line, just as it hits the seam between the slow and the fast water, the fish takes the fly. So that's often where we're going to find bass, the same place we'd find a trout, just on that edge between the fast water and the slow water. And here's a really nice fish that was quite cooperative and gave me a good fight. Now in this example, the current is a little bit more consistent from where I'm standing to about 50 feet out, where it gets a little bit faster, and I've just dropped my cast into that faster water, and as it swings into slower water, there we go, there's a fish waiting for it. Again, very much like a trout situation. However, in this case, I could find fish pretty well anywhere in that stretch, because there is current. As you can see, there's current even where I'm standing. So you could find fish right where that bass is now fighting me. So I would be prepared to fish that entire stretch thoroughly. However, as you can see, the best place was on the inside seam of that stronger current. Now in this scenario, we have two current seams. We have the near foam line, and there's also another current seam further away with another foam line. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cast well beyond the first foam line, land my fly beyond the second foam line, and now I've made a mend. And I want you to see how the way I've mended my line is to keep the line in between those two current seams. So I'll keep that fly moving more slowly, and it'll sink a little bit more. And then I just let it swing. I don't have to mend it anymore. And as that fly enters that second foam line, there we go. There's a fish waiting for it just as it crosses into it. He hit it once, and then he hit it a second time, and I hooked him up on the second try. So when you're looking at these foam lines, you have to think just like trout. These foam lines give bass plenty of opportunity to take prey. The minnows will be following the insect life, and they'll be following the minnows. So don't be afraid to work foam lines just like you would as if you were trout fishing. And the other thing too is, mend only where required. I only put that mend in so as to avoid having my fly dragged too much by that foam line that was close to me. So when you're fishing a floating line for bass, be prepared to look at the same current features that you would see on a trout river. Look for the foam lines, look for the seams, look for the current breaks, because just like trout, bass won't sit in that fast current. They'll sit on the edges, the margins, and wait for prey to appear. As I say, the minnows chase the bugs and the bass chase the minnows. So keep that in mind. Always look for those current seams and current breaks. Okay. And you can see, it's quite effective. It's a lot of fun. Not only do you feel it hit, you often see it. It's almost like dry fly fishing in a way. You're swinging in that streamer just like you would for trout or steelhead or Atlantic salmon, and those bass are coming up and whacking it. And even when you're fishing over 3 or 4 feet of water, they're still willing to come up and take that bait fish imitation that you're using over the surface of the water. So you might want to look at my Weimer series, the brown trout Weimer, the black-nosed dace Weimer, a couple of the others, for good possibilities for bait fish imitations to use in these circumstances. So a floating line, a relatively long leader, 8 to 10 foot. I like to use fluorocarbon, but you can use regular mono as well, no magic there. And just get that out and just let that fly swim around and move. The only caveat I'd put in there, if you're going to use rabbit, put a little bit of weight on the fly to get it to penetrate. But if you're using one of my more sparse patterns, like my perch pattern, which really gets under, then you don't need weight. It'll work just fine unweighted. So give it a try. It's a ton of fun. Cheers. There we go.
Just that question.
Yep. Another.